Hello, everybody. Good evening to all of you. Welcome to the 7th lecture of JR Lakshman Rao's Birth Centenary Year series. This lecture series is very special to the family of Professor JR Lakshman Rao and Breakthrough. Professor Lakshman Rao leaves a rich legacy of science in Karnataka and in India. He was a pioneer in popular science communication in Karnataka and also the founder of the institution KRVP. He also served as a chief lexicographer for English Kannada dictionary published by Mysore University. As we pay tribute to Professor Lakshman Rao today, he, to this day, will be remembered as a person who enriched science communication in local language. Today's talk is as special as the previous description as I mentioned. Breakthrough Science Society, in collaboration with All India People Science Network, today observe in the spirit of National Scientific Temper Day on August 20th, as we pay tribute to Dr. Narendra Dabholkar, a noted science and social activist who's also a rationalist, who spearheaded the campaign on anti-superstition. Today, we have with us Professor Prajval Shastri, who would speak on "Do Scientists Cultivate Scientific Thinking?" Professor Prajval Shastri has been an astrophysicist for nearly 40 years. She got her PhD from the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, and after postdoc at University of Texas Austin, University of California Berkeley, and the Harvard-Smithsonian Centre for Astrophysics, she was a faculty at the Indian Institute of Astrophysics, Bengaluru, for 23 years. In her research, she specializes in the investigation of giant black holes that are found in the centers of distant galaxies using telescopes at frequencies ranging from radio to X-rays. She's extremely passionate about science outreach, believes that cultivation of scientific thinking is for everyone, and uses astrophysics as a vehicle to engage lay audiences of all ages with these questions. She's also deeply concerned about the gender disparity in sciences. So as part of talk today, she would be speaking as to how in the contemporary Indian society, there's deep disconnect between citizens who are ready to accept technology on one hand, but being distant from the scientific way of understanding the world around us on the other. What does this conundrum mean for scientists and their science practice? Is the problem something to do with funding for science or education? I think Professor Prajval will look into it. Over to you, Prajval.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you're good.
Okay. So thank you very much, everybody, and in particular, Anil Kumar Jagalur and Deepthi Bhagwatullah. It is an honor to speak in a series that is in memory of Professor Jagalur Lakshmana Rao. All the work that we are doing is in the wake of what people like him started and excelled in. He did that through his writings and his actions, including the founding of the Karnataka Rajya Vijnana Parishad, of which I'm a member. I'm also thrilled that this is one of the many preludes, as Deepthi mentioned, to the countrywide observance of the National Scientific Temper Day, the 20th of August, tomorrow, the day that one of the champions of scientific temper, Dr. Narendra Dabholkar, was assassinated because of his views. I would also like to remember Ratnashri Nandiwada, a fellow astrophysicist, dear friend, someone whom we lost to COVID-19 this May. She was the director of the Delhi Planetarium, and she was a colossus in the astrophysics and science communication world, who stood for many of the things that I will talk about just by being herself. It is possible that the title of my talk was not a question for Professor Lakshman Rao, because as someone who started out as a student of science, but also influenced by literary, political, and philosophical thinkers, ranging from Kuvempu and J.P. Rajaratnam to Karl Marx, he later evolved from being a teacher of chemistry to a science writer on an extremely broad canvas. But today, this is a very important question. And here, when I say scientists, I mean practitioners of science. So professors of science in colleges and universities like Professor Lakshman Rao, scientists in research institutions, in R&D divisions of the corporate sector, doctors, nurses. I include all of these under the rubric of practicing scientist. So I will start with what astrophysicists do. So astrophysicists look at the sky and the goings on in the sky and try to understand that using the laws of physics. So most of the little dots in the sky that we see tend to be stars. A few are planets, like this one, and these, which we are all familiar with. But most of the others are stars like our own sun. And if you have a sky which is really dark, something that is extremely rare nowadays, but still accessible in some distant areas away from cities, one can see just with the naked eye roughly 3,000 stars or so. So most of these little dots are stars within our Milky Way, which is our cosmic home. Some of them are not stars. For example, like this nebula, which is within the Orion constellation, which is a common sight during winter skies. It's not a star, but a region where stars actually form. And if you have a really dark sky, you might actually see the Milky Way, like people of my generation could see even from towns when we were children. And this is, as I said, our cosmic home. It contains several billion stars, which are bound together by gravity. Now, it turns out that of the many thousands of dots in the sky, there is one rather nondescript dot, which is actually another galaxy, like the Milky Way. It's called the Andromeda. This is a picture taken of it by my astrophotographer friend Kirti Kiran from Ladakh. And if you were to have the Andromeda galaxy and the moon together in the sky, it would appear much bigger than that of the moon. But it is a galaxy that the Milky Way would look like if we went outside of the Milky Way and could see it. So a swirling mass of stars bound by gravity. And it turns out that in the center of both the Milky Way and the Andromeda galaxy, there is a giant black hole, which by giant, I mean it is extremely heavy. That is several million times as heavy as our own sun. And the fascinating, as if this were not fascinating enough, if you look at any bit of sky, like this piece that I show here, which is a bit of sky that is roughly 10th the size of the moon, that bit contains almost 10,000 galaxies as we can see today with our facilities today. So this is a picture taken by the Hubble Space Telescope. And each of these galaxies are likely to have such a giant black hole in the middle. Now, these are the kind of things that I study. But the point is that these black holes, or what happens to them, or what they do, is really not relevant to our daily lives on Earth. So why then does the government of India fund us to do research of this sort? I'm paid a salary. I was paid a salary when I was faculty at the Indian Institute of Astrophysics. There are many, many others like me all over the country. Not only do they pay our salaries, the government also invests in facilities like this one, the Ooty Radio Telescope, or the Venubapu Observatory, or the Giant Meter Wave Radio Telescope in Maharashtra, in order that we may observe the sky and do this kind of research. So why is this? So if we go back to the makings of our policy, there was something called the India's Science Policy Resolution 1958, which was adopted by Parliament. And what was its vision? So to quote from this document, it says the intense cultivation of science on a large scale has radically altered man's material environment, provided new tools of thought, and has extended our mental horizon. It has influenced the basic values of life and given civilization a new vitality and dynamism. And then it goes on to say the government has decided to foster, promote, and sustain the cultivation of science and scientific research, pure, applied, and educational. In other words, there was this very clear vision that science-driven policies will be enabled by policies for science, for the practice of science. Indeed, scientific temper has become enshrined in the Constitution, as we all know, as a fundamental duty of citizens. So the Constitution of India, Article 51A(h) says to develop the scientific temper, humanism, and the spirit of inquiry and reform is a duty of all citizens. And the point is, although this is a very strong statement and very strong words, these haven't been mere words. Science is a mandatory subject in schools, something that we take for granted, but it was a consequence of deliberate policy. Science is a mandatory discipline in tertiary education. Many science research institutes of excellence have been generously funded countrywide, and large science funding agencies have been created. So what has been the actual impact of all of these things in the public sphere? Let us take the example of the pandemic, which is something that looms large in all our minds and has been for the last more than a year now. So if we look at the positives first, here are some news items from what happened in Chhattisgarh in early 2020, where the state administration began by setting up a team as early as 21st of January 2020, before the first case was even reported in India. And screening began at Raipur Airport on the 28th of January. By March, tracing those with a history of foreign travel had happened. 76,000 people had been home quarantined. And so by the time the first case was detected, the government was prepared to follow the 3 T's, the trace, test, and treat policy. The other example, of course, is Kerala, which is much better known and much better visible in the media. I will only quote one small example of a family where they discovered they had COVID and so on. So this person says, we didn't know much about the coronavirus then. The newspapers actually accused them of having hidden their travel details and so forth. And he came out with this statement saying, thank God I was in Kerala. In other words, the empathetic voices of the doctors and the nurses and health officials helped them, and their actions treated them in the way it was supposed to be treated, taking into account all the scientific contexts. And so it is not very surprising that the recent statistics that were published in the Hindu, for example, show that Kerala actually showed excess deaths during the pandemic year. They actually showed a deficit of deaths during the pandemic year, as opposed to all the other states which show excess of deaths. And you do expect a deficit when there are lockdowns because there are less of traffic accidents and so on. And Kerala is the only state which shows that deficit. But that is only a minority, one would say, or a small bit of the whole scene where we saw science used properly in order to tackle the pandemic. Most of the time, we saw things like this instead. So there was all this thing about cumulative reverberations from plate clanging. There were claims that it boosted blood circulation in the body. It rendered the virus ineffective. There were reports that the virus had receded. There were claims that the virus had receded, and there was evidence for it from NASA data. There was a minister of state for social justice and empowerment who thought it fit to lead a whole tight cluster of people chanting "Go Corona, go." And all of these kinds of things get added credence when you have things like the Government of India, Department of Science and Technology, funding something called the Sutra Pick program, which is a program to so-called investigate cow science. In fact, this whole situation triggered me to write a piece in the newspapers titled "The Unscientific Temper of India." So we have a conundrum in our country. On the one hand, we have embraced modern technologies in daily living, mobile phones, fetal diagnostic equipment, even the excitement of Chandrayaan, and particularly Chandrayaan-2, which was meant to achieve soft landing on the moon. Actually, the goals of Chandrayaan were scientific, and it was about exploration of the moon by several different means, including the orbiter and this lander, which was supposed to land on the moon and explore. But the whole focus was on this achievement of soft landing on the moon. But on the other hand, the very same people who use all of these things, mobile phones, fetal diagnostic equipment, excitement about Chandrayaan, there appears to be little recognition of the science that underlies these technologies, and indeed the use of scientific thinking to understand even very simple natural phenomena is absent. So one case in point is the solar eclipse of June last year, and this is a picture of me and a few friends on the Lal Bagh Rock in Bengaluru watching the eclipse. It was in the middle of the day. It was a crescent sun that was visible, and most of Bengaluru city, which although has a tradition of being a science city and so on, was ensconced inside the home watching the eclipse on TV. So you might ask why? Why is this? So one obviously has to talk about our early science education, because the science education that we conduct in schools values information load over understanding. It has sidelined learning by doing. And science is conveyed as an authoritative rather than a debatable thing. And we have a classroom culture of unquestioning obedience. And science is thought of as a subject rather than as a way of life. But what about the scientists? So are our laboratories citizens of scientific thinking? Do we have debates in our scientific institutions of the kind that there should be? Do we have the sort of climate that there isn't one authoritative truth within these institutions? Unfortunately, succumbing to astrology and shuckling pregnant women during eclipses, these are practices which are prevalent among scientists as well, even among scientists in the most prestigious elite institutions, such as the Indian Institute of Science. And even climate change deniers are not uncommon, even among the eminent scientists in these prestigious institutions. And it is, after all, the scientists who have designed the kind of sutrapic kind of programs that I talked about. It's not that this sort of thing did not get pushback. In fact, we had Professor Pushpa Bhargava, who was the founder director of the Center for Cell and Molecular Biology in Hyderabad, who advocated a lot for scientific thinking among scientists. And he finally resigned from all the very prestigious science academies in disillusionment because he could not get scientists to take a stand on matters like this. So why is this? Is it that science is not funded enough? In other words, will heavier funding for science R&D change the regressive climate within scientific institutions and therefore in outside society? So many of you perhaps recall or even participated in the March for Science events, which started in 2017. And one of the first demands of the March for Science was higher funding for science. And I will argue that higher funding for science is not going to address the problems that I just mentioned. Mind you, I'm not arguing that science should not be funded, because when we ask the question, is science funded enough, we have to compare that with something. So if you compare how much science is funded in India to the percentage of GDP, not that the GDP is something really sacrosanct, but it does measure something. And if you look at what fraction of the GDP is allocated for science compared to that in other countries, it is extremely low. Or one could compare the amount of funding given for science as opposed to the amount of funding given for, say, defense. Even by that comparison, the amount of science funding is low. And so I very much resonate with the claims of March for Science. In fact, I participated in the March for Science every time, as can be seen here. But the question is, will heavier funding for science address the problems, the regressive climate that I talked about that exists within science institutions and within science practice? So what are the facts? First of all, increasing scientific awareness in society has come from civil society and not from scientific institutions. So there has been the All India People Science Network and the Breakthrough Science Society, which are country-wide organizations, but there are many others as well at the state level and local ones. And they are the ones who have been building scientific awareness. It is the All India Safe Education Committee which brought media and public attention to mythology passing off for science in high school science textbooks. And mind you, this was not in the history textbooks, it was in the science textbooks, at least in Karnataka, that was the case. And the anti-superstition bill in Karnataka was passed in the legislature, but that was because of the leadership and the push, which was given by the Pragatipara Mathadishara Vedike, which is a progressive religious institution leaders forum in Karnataka. So it's interesting to go back to the Science Policy Resolution of 1958 and an assessment of it and its impact in about 1970. So this is from a paper that was written by Bhalchandra Udgamkar in the Economic and Political Weekly. He was a particle physicist in the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, and he organized a conference to assess the impacts of the scientific policy resolution of 1958. And this is quoting from his assessment and paper that he wrote in 1970. So he says the scientific policy resolution is an admirable document and needs no modification. This seemed to be the conclusion of the conference. Government's support to R&D has had a doubling time of 5 years, which was seen as commendable. Universities, research laboratories, and qualified scientists and engineers have grown very rapidly, they say. So India is no longer underdeveloped in building up the infrastructure for science and technology. However, he says, as a country, we continue to be poor. This is in 1970, mind you. The national science managers continue to harbor an underdevelopment syndrome. They are still paying a heavy price, meaning we as science practitioners are still paying a heavy price by being dependent on the West. And frustration in scientists and engineers is leading to a brain drain. He says there is a sad lack of dialogue between universities and national laboratories. And he also says that democratization, as well as a sort of esprit de corps, which was implied in the Science Policy Resolution 58, has not happened. He goes on to say that the impact of science on society means the utilization of scientific concepts, methodology, and materials, and manpower for nation-building activities of all kinds. For innovation, not just technological, but innovation and systems analysis approach to problems of health, social affairs, and education. In fact, the whole fabric of national activity. The document also concludes, that is, Udgaonkar also concludes by saying it also includes an attack on the problems created by science. And he lists pollution, changes in life patterns produced by urbanization, and so on. And he says these are yet to receive active recognition, not just by the government, but also by the scientific community. And he says this is a situation that must change. And he says both, that is, both the government as well as scientists have to take responsibility in this regard. So, unfortunately, science within the laboratories are driven a bit by curiosity, but mostly they seem to be driven as for personal livelihoods and personal glory. And there is no requirement to subscribe to the scientific method as a way of life. So, this is clearly a problem. But what is also a problem is that surprisingly few scientists engage with lay audiences. That is also something that is not a mandate of a scientist. So therefore, we as scientists employed in public funded enterprises are seldom held accountable by the public. So what is the way forward? So scientists, I think, must subscribe to the scientific method as a way of life, and they must be truly accountable. So how can scientists be truly accountable? First of all, public engagement must become a mandate. Outsourcing science communication is not a desirable thing. Science communication should not be made in the deficit model, meaning that we are the knowledgeable scientists and we are going to deliver scientific knowledge to the common people who are like an empty pot which we will fill. Many of us who have engaged in science communication know that science communication is actually a two-way street, that engagement, serious engagement with lay audiences of all kinds and all ages actually deepens our own understanding of our area of expertise, just like teaching deepens our understanding of what we are trying to teach. And in fact, this realization can be quite inspiring. So science communication cannot happen in the deficit model. Also, scientists need to take a stand on the religion-science standoff. And by that I mean not that you can't hold personal views on religion, but it is important to make the distinction that science and the scientific method tries to explain the goings-on in the physical world around us, whereas religions, whichever it is, of all flavors from all over the world, the goal of religion is to explore the self, our relationship with the self, and our relationship with our fellow human beings, and ask questions such as, why is there conflict and hatred and jealousy and all of those things? And so the goal of religion is not to explain the physical world around us. And so then we need to take a stand on this regardless of what our religious affiliation might be. That putting religion and science as a standoff itself is a flawed approach. Also, we need to ask whether scientific institutions are welcoming of everyone. Is science being projected as being done by everyone? An example of this, a case in point, I would say, is the magazine Resonance. It's a monthly science education magazine published by the Indian Academy of Sciences and meant for adult science buffs and undergrad science students. And we, as part of my gender equity work, it came about that we decided to guest edit one issue of this. And the reason was the following. We looked at the author list of the authors that write for this magazine, and we compared that with the pool of people available to write such articles, which is the science PhDs employed in higher education. And if you look at the gender fraction of science PhDs employed in higher education, and this was in 2015 that we looked at the statistics, there are roughly 45% women in that cohort. Whereas the author list of Resonance between 2014 and 2016 showed that the fraction of women authors was less than 15% for all of sciences. So therefore, we decided to bring out a special issue, and I guest edited that along with a colleague, biologist colleague from Delhi, Sudeshna Majumdar. And we brought up this issue with an all-women authorship. And our goal was not to showcase writings or science by women scientists. Our goal was simply to show that women scientists can write as competently as any other scientist for any kind of audience, including the audience of Resonance. So this issue was brought out in March to commemorate Women's Day and so forth. But what was the impact of this? So when we brought out this special issue, we said in the editorial board that it was not hard to find women scientists to write for Resonance. So I had the responsibility of assembling the author list. I had a list of 20 very, very competent women scientists who I was going to ask. There was only space for 10 of them, and all the first 10 that I asked said yes. So we had this special issue, and I also had this other list of scientists who could have written for a future issue of Resonance, who I didn't even reach out to because I did not I did not need to. So we wrote in the editorial, and it was essentially a message to the editorial board that the skewed gender fraction of authors was not okay, because it is projecting that science is only done by men, and B, it was not necessary because there was plenty of women scientists who could also write for it. But you can see from this statistic, which is the gender distribution of authors for the whole year in 2017, that the fraction is very low in January, February. Then we had the March issue, which we brought out with an all-women authorship. And then things went back to business as usual after that. So clearly the message did not go through. And it did not go through even in subsequent years, except for these two issues in these 2 months, where there's a more reasonable gender fraction of authors. So science for everyone means internalizing that we are scientists who are publicly funded and therefore accountable to the public. Science for everyone means understanding that striving for a scientific-minded citizenry is an obligation on us practicing scientists. And furthermore, I would say, given the current scenario, it is an imperative. And science for everyone means recognizing a stake in a scientifically minded citizenry that can hold a scientific enterprise accountable. So, in other words, science for everyone means not just acknowledging, but also striving for public ownership of science. So I'll stop there and I'll take questions.
Thank you, Prajval. That was very insightful talk. And, we see that, what's the reality of scientific thinking in a country, especially during COVID. We just cited some instances. And this shows that, what is the role of scientists, especially, when public engagement, I think that is a key to take science and research. I mean, that is a future, certainly not just for bringing out something, but yes, to impart scientific thinking and scientific temper in society. So we'll start taking questions. So probably you can start answering. So there's Mr. Nagaraj who asks, does Indian media not have a role to play in the poor understanding of scientific method? BBC Radio 4 does a weekly program called The Life Scientific that provides fascinating interview with a working scientist, usually an academic, about what drives his work. So what do you like to say on that?
I agree, media has a very strong role to play. Our print media try, I think, but it's not that easy to find scientists who will actually allocate time to do this sort of thing. Because what I find in my own experience is that, on the one hand, practicing scientists find very hard to get out of their sort of what the Dilbert comic calls the jargon matrix. So they find it very hard to get out of their jargon matrix and try to share their research findings or the context of their research and so on with the public. And one important thing here is that for scientists, it's important to not confine ourselves to just sharing accomplishments of science. We also have to share the process of science. So how we know what we know. So we have to share the failures. Why did we fail? We also have to share the uncertainty, that doing science is about uncertainty, and how do we see ourselves as comfortable with that uncertainty, and how there is no one absolute truth. We try to reach the truth, but we don't claim to have reached the truth. We are constantly attempting to reach the truth by trying to falsify what we already know. And so when we say this is what I found, it means that we are constantly just trying to falsify. We're trying to build on previous scholarship. So all these kind of things need to be foregrounded when we communicate science, not just the sort of accomplishments and the fancy accomplishments and just focusing on the outcome. But there is a more basic problem in which I said before, which is that scientists are not, I would say, I wouldn't say they're incompetent. I think if people tried, everybody would be competent. If it was mandated, everybody would become competent to communicate science. But because it is not mandated, it is easy to sort of shove it to the few people who are anyway passionate about it, or outsource it by hiring full-time science communicators within science institutions. So that said, I mean, I'm not against hiring full-time science communicators within science institutions, but I think they have a slightly different role to play. They have a role to persuade scientists to engage with the public, to train scientists to engage with the public, because that is their expertise. Science communication is their expertise, and also critique how scientists engage with the public and how scientists practice science within their institutions. I mean, are they truly cognizant of this accountability, and are they truly cognizant that science practice is a public-funded enterprise? And if they are not, it is the role of the full-time science communicator within an institute to actually bring that into science practice, which is currently lacking. So I think that is the role of a full-time science communicator. Not the role is not to sort of take the job from the scientists and do it themselves, because I think it needs to be part of every scientist's mandate to engage with the public. So that is one handicap I would say the media faces when they try to get scientists to engage with public audiences. But there is also the other side, which is that the media, the print media is sort of okay in this, but the digital media, especially in regional languages, are extremely, unscientific in their framework itself. And they don't get any pushback either from the regulators or from the scientists. So I think this is a problem, and I would say that the scientific community is responsible for this, because they are not pushing back. They don't want to. They don't see the problem that regional language media is so unscientific, and they are unwilling to put in time. In fact, it is many of these channels violate their license agreement when they project these unscientific frameworks, but there is nobody to push back on them, or not enough people to push back. And so there are all these different problems. So it has to be a concerted effort. I think one can't just blame the media.
Okay. Yeah, I think Vidya just posted a point that she says, there are a lot of science programs, but they're not given prime slots. It's usually in the afternoon where nobody's there to listen. So, yeah, that's the status. And so there's one question from Anil. So he says, science is what we do outside the house, is the attitude of many. So how do you think this can be changed?
Yeah, so exactly. So, I've actually had examples where, people who are even scientists in very prestigious institutions say that, that is their livelihood, and, this is their life. So even though they may be good at their science and produce research papers and all that, that has no impact whatsoever on their actual way of life and their actual thinking. And this is a serious problem, because then it will impact all the younger people that they mentor, because they will be mentoring people with the same mentality that science is for livelihood and nothing more than that, and your way of life doesn't have to subscribe to the scientific method at all. And this is a serious problem. So I feel that our institutional structures have to change. So as of now, institutional structures are such that they hire scientists as well as promote scientists purely on the basis of their research publications. And maybe a little bit of weightage given to their teaching ability. Not much, not enough, even that. So I think there has to be structural change so that hiring criteria and promotion criteria include a person's teaching ability and track record and public engagement ability and track record. So it has to get formalized. So when that becomes a mandate, then more people will engage with the public. And my point is that when you engage with the public seriously, and there is more, you will be held more accountable for how you practice your science. I would say that subscription to the scientific method should be a requirement to be a public funded scientist. But it's not clear it's not clear to me how that can be enforced, but it should be. I believe it should. So these two things, that we have to change our structures to have science teaching and science public engagement of science as part of our mandate and evaluated on those things in addition to evaluation of our research. And when we hire people, we need to hire people who subscribe to the scientific method.
All right. So there's one question. So you also, brought up this point on the education system, right? So Vidya ma'am says that, she finds teachers themselves don't have scientific temper when they teach. So what do you, say about, teachers, about what kind of education they should impart, keeping scientific temper in mind?
Well, to start with, I mean, if scientists in elite research institutions don't have, scientific thinking, it's kind of not so fair to blame, teachers, because, scientists in research institutions, after all, are the most highly qualified in science, and elite research institutions are the most heavily funded by the government to do science. And as we saw in the science policy resolution that I talked about, the intent was to high funding of elite institutions was in order to make our society a scientifically thinking society. So it's not fair to kind of put the blame on the science teachers entirely. But at a practical level, I think one handicap that teachers have is that the activity the activity component of their, what they're supposed to do as per the textbook, goes on the back burner, because once the child reaches high school, the teachers are busy trying to sort of prepare their students for all these entrance exams. And one hallmark of all the entrance exams, whether it is the JEE for the elite IITs or any other, they don't give any emphasis to experimental experience. So children don't have had to do any experiments, or they don't need any adeptness in that sort of exploration in order to answer these exams. So then it goes to the back burner. Teachers are in a sense forced, right? Because I mean, they do what they can. They have to finish their portions, and if they have to also do these activities, even the ones, forget about like innovative extra activities that some teachers might actually want to do, because there are a lot of creative teachers. Forget about those. Even the ones which is stated in the textbook. Even to do those, they don't have enough time because they're pressured to coach their children for all these entrance exams. So there's a serious structural problem there as well. Yeah, so we do need to think seriously about that.
Right. I think we all agree that with COVID situation, with children learning everything online, I mean, how would you even learn science without doing? That's the big question and the challenge ahead. So yeah. So there's a comment by Mr. Mallesh who says that, I wish scientists in research institutes and faculty in universities form several teams and visit educational institutions overall throughout the country to see what the situation is. Any thoughts on that?
They won't do it unless it becomes part of their mandate, on the basis of which they are evaluated and promoted and hired. It won't happen. It will happen only like it happens now, which is like a small minority of scientists who are passionate about outreach. They continue to do it. In fact, in some institutions, it actually works against them, because then they are told, because you couldn't think of what next research paper to write, you went and talked to a bunch of high school students. So it's actually currently looked down upon. So unless that changes, it will not happen on a large scale.
So there's one question by Nagaraj. In fact, it's his comment. He says that of late, a lot of unscientific ideas are being propagated in the name of ancient wisdom. So how should scientists react? I mean, he says scientists must be more vociferous to oppose it. So,
he says what? Sorry, what was the bit about vociferous?
Yeah, he says scientists should be more vociferous to oppose it.
Yeah. So, there has been enormous amount of writing on this. In fact, I think Soumitra gave a talk. Soumitra Banerjee from Breakthrough Centenary gave a talk on ancient Indian science. So, there are advances in both science and technology that have happened in medieval India and ancient India and all that, like they have happened all over the world. It's not some sort of Indian exceptionalism, and we need to recognize that, and it's interesting to learn about those and so on. But to say that everything that we know today, for example, was already conceived of in ancient India is a completely absurd sort of starting point. In fact, this whole DST Sutra Pick program is an example of that, where because when you come to it with that framework, you're no longer using the scientific method. You're no longer testing a hypothesis. You're already assuming a certain truth. And you're then saying, let us find the evidence for it. The point is that in scientific institutions, there needs to be acknowledgement that there is no such truth. There needs to be a climate of fearlessness. So there needs to be, scientists or university professors or teachers or whatever, their academic freedom needs to be safeguarded. So they should have the space to express opinions. They may be opinions, against some authority. They may be opinions against the government, but they need to have the space to express their opinions. Currently, that is not there. So it is known, it has happened that the Government of India service rules are used against scientists when they express views, all that. So that is a sort of thing that needs to be safeguarded, and debate and discourse does need to be encouraged. It needs to be encouraged among young people as well. So students need to be encouraged to form study circles and to debate on various issues. All institutions have a certain code of conduct that students need to, behave in certain ways so that they don't negatively impact their fellow students or be associated. So as long as students follow their code of conduct, they should be allowed to openly debate and have arguments and so on all issues, not just issues of physics or some large hadron collider experiment, but on all issues of science, of society, of the interaction between them, and so on. So that needs to be encouraged so that younger people, get into it. So this problem that there is this sort of fetish about so-called celebrating so-called ancient science and claiming that every little thing that modern technology has come up with was actually known in the ancient past in India. Um, that wouldn't cut much ice if everybody had the ability to debate and discuss in a reasoned way.
Right. Agree, Prajwal. So there's one comment by Anil. He says that during every eclipse, there are TV programs which has gurus and astrologers, and there's just one representative of science. He or she is never given a chance to speak. Can scientists seek to be part of such programs instead of waiting to be included part of the panel? In fact, I've seen you speaking. I've seen you on TV9 and public TV coming and talking. So, yeah, I want to listen to your panel.
Yeah, absolutely. I think scientists do need to take a more proactive role. I think leaders of research institutions should facilitate that, not leave it to individual scientists. The scientific community needs to throw its weight behind this and support their scientists who do find the time, make the time to push back on all of this. And also the legal recourse. I mean, these channels are in violation of their license agreement when they perpetuate false claims. So that also needs to be tackled. The problem is that, generally there is a climate that we are in this institution, we are doing in our laboratory, we're doing our science, we give talks, we give seminars, and then we do all this exciting research, no doubt. We mentor students, but there's stuff like TV channels and all that. This is kind of seen as just outside our arena, and I think that is a problem. Because after all, we're part of that society. We probably go home and watch those same channels. There's a problem if we think of that as sort of disconnected somehow from our own lives. So I think what Anil is saying is absolutely correct. We absolutely need to push back much heavier.
Anuradha asked this, that is there any comparative study of scientific attitude among scientists in different countries?
So there's a recent book. There was a survey, not exactly scientific thinking. It was more, actually, it was more focused on religion and people's. How scientists view religion. So there has been a survey done by some scientists from Houston, and they just published a book. I forget the title of that book, but the first author is Heckland or something. I can try and put it in the chat.
Sure.
But that was not the same thing. That is like more about religion, and it does come up that religion finds its way into scientific institutions and so on. But yeah, it is not exactly that, because the thing is that there are two issues here, right? There is the business about a scientific attitude and a scientific way of life. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to, for example, be an atheist or something. I mean, I'm a practicing atheist. I've been raised as an atheist. I'm a practicing atheist. But we do need to recognize that the role of religion is to explore the self, not to explain natural phenomena around us. So that is one sort of area where there is this religion. But the other thing is that because scientific institutions are publicly funded institutions, they also are secular places. They're secular spaces. So they have to be treated as such. So then it can become problematic when that is not happening. So in this survey that they did, both these things kind of get a little bit mixed up. But nevertheless, it's an interesting survey. But I don't know of a survey exactly like what the questionnaire is asking. Yeah.
Sure. On the similar lines, I mean, any stats or something that you are aware of, in public engagement, scientists with public, in other countries, anything on that?
Well, no, I don't have statistics. What I know is that, for example, many years ago in the United States, the National Science Foundation, which is the main funding agency to which you have to write proposals in order to fund your research, they required that some small fraction of the budget be for public engagement. They required you to describe your science proposal in a way that you would describe to the public. So what is your science question? Explain that to a lay audience, kind of thing. That had to be part of your proposal. And then you had to sort of say how you would do this public engagement with the science results that you would get out of that particular scientific research. Now, even in India, this has been adopted, I think. So we know that funding agencies are recognizing this and making it part of the formal sort of mandate of any research project. How many actually do sort of rigorous public engagement and scientific outreach? I don't have statistics on that, but my sort of sense is that, especially in the younger generation in the West, it is very, very common for them to actively, and it is acknowledged and it is valued. It is not as valued in the Indian science community. So you at best, you might get brownie points for doing it, at best. You don't get wrapped on the wrist for not doing it. So.
Okay. Sure. So this, a question from a listener who says that, the government spends setting up astrology department and homeopathy departments, etc. Also calls them science. Now, as citizens, how should we respond to this, and what effects could these pose if such scientists start engaging with people?
What could these pose if what? I missed the last bit.
So what effects could these pose if such scientists, who are linked to this, would start engaging with people?
Yeah. So having these departments itself is, I mean, in my opinion, not right. When astrology was introduced into universities in 2000, I think 5 or something, many of us wrote petitions and so on. But clearly the pushback was not enough. Clearly, many more scientists should have engaged. The Science Academy should have engaged with this and pushed back. Just like finally, the Science Academy did write a position paper when one of the ministers said that evolution should be knocked off the textbooks. Finally, then the Academy did take a position and did write something. But this should have happened much earlier, and this should have happened much stronger. So it's a serious problem. Citizens also need to throw their weight behind this, but I mean, the way things work in our country, there isn't that kind of engagement with policy, right, by citizens at large. We have elections once in 5 years. We might vote for a set of policies, the manifesto or whatever. But if something comes in between, then there is, of course, if it is up for debate and it goes through the the whole process of public open for public comment and debate and all that, then there is some scope for us to respond. But sometimes that is not there also. So definitely the citizens need to find voices somehow, maybe through different fora. Maybe they need to make a push through their members of parliament, through their MLAs and so on, to push for, this kind of thing to not happen. Scientists definitely need to push. I would say the highest responsibility for these things happening rests with the scientists, because they simply haven't pushed back. I mean, they are a loud voice. They do get listened to if they make their, if they open their mouths. But if we are silent, then of course nothing will happen. So the kind of pushback that this evolution being knocked off the textbooks thing elicited, that is the kind of very loud response that needs to go out for these astrology kind of things. As far as impact, yeah, they have a very strong impact. It gets a lot of credence, because then it's not these fringe elements in society who are advocating things like this. They become very legitimate, degree holding, publicly supported people. So it is a very negative impact then. Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, Aru says very insightful presentation. Thank you. And there's one comment by Anuradha. She says that she remembered her survey, the survey about atheism, the one that you mentioned, right? So she's wondering if there was one on scientific temper to a survey on that. So this paradox cannot be a uniquely Indian phenomena, or is it something like that? What do you say?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I mean, I know many astrophysicists outside of India who are not atheists, shall we say, who do believe in a supreme being and so on as part of their religious beliefs. But that does not seem to lead to this kind of a disconnect. So, for example, there are these fringe elements in the so-called Christian tradition who don't agree with evolution and have their own take on it. And there is this move in the United States to, talk about creationism as a pathway to modern civilization rather than evolution and all of that. But the people I know don't take these religious books and all that literally. They take them as things which give them insight into human relationships, into how human civilization has evolved, into how we deal with our fellow human beings, with our larger community, and how we react to the very negative things, that the ups and downs of life that happen both in our personal lives and in outside and so forth. So there isn't a taking literally everything that is said in a so-called religious authority book. So then it's different. So then, of course, they will not. I mean, I don't know any scientist outside of India who subscribes to astrology, for example, or who would. So that is the difference here. There are not that there are no superstitious beliefs in the Western world or in Africa or something, but I mean, people always give me this example of, it's not only in India, there are hotels which don't have the 13th floor and whatever. I mean, not that they don't have the 13th floor, but they skip the number 30 and so on. But they're all on the fringe. In India, it is mainstream. It is not just people who are so-called uneducated. In fact, I would say it's the reverse. It is worse in among educated. I remember going to Kanyakumari for the annular solar eclipse of 2010, and everybody was outside watching the eclipse. I mean, all the staff of the hotel that I was in, all the shopkeepers, all the people on the street. It was Ayyappa season. All the Ayyappa devotees, they were all outside watching the eclipse. Whereas in Bengaluru, everybody was indoors. There wasn't a soul on the street. The roads were empty, you know. It's not to do with education, formal education. And as I said, we know that even scientists employed by very prestigious institutions practice sort of these things like shackling the women if they are pregnant during an eclipse and so on. So yeah, that thing is something I have seen only in India. I have not seen this in the Western world of science.
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, there's a nice survey report that Vidyavan has posted. So she says that there's an above survey report where more than half of scientists in India, Italy, Taiwan, and Turkey self-identify as religious. So this is actually a report that she's reading out, and it's striking that approximately twice as many convinced atheists exist in the general population of Hong Kong. For example, 55%, compared with the scientific community in this region, which is 26%. So yeah, this is some hard-hitting fact. All right.
Yeah,
so,
but the thing is, I think the question needs to be more precise. I don't think it's. I mean, I'm saying this as an atheist myself, that science doesn't necessarily lead you to atheism, but what it leads you to is a scientific way of understanding the physical world around us. It leads you to recognizing that religious inquiry is about relationships, about the self, and about why is there hatred and why is there conflict between people, and why is there jealousy, and also about how one as an individual copes with these things. So so that recognizing that is what is important. Whereas when you have in India, in a TV channel, you have astrologers coming on the TV channel in order to explain a physical phenomenon like the eclipse. So that is a problem, because there is only one. The scientific method is the best method we have to explain the physical goings on around us. It may not be perfect, but it is the best we have. It is self-correcting. And so that is the thing. So I think framing the question as, are you an atheist or not, may not, I mean, that's an interesting question, not that it's not interesting, but that is not the crux here in what we are talking about. I think the crux here is, do you believe the scientific method explains the world around you or not?
Agree. So so Anil says that he was listening to Jim Al-Khalil and Brian Cox discuss that because they do science popularization, they're treated as scientists enough. But it is changing in UK. But other places have a long way to go. So did you experience that kind of a bias somewhere here?
Bias, I didn't understand. I mean, are you saying that if you do public engagement, then you're seen as less of a scientist? Is that what you're saying? Or
no, I think it's the other way. Yeah, it's the other way. I mean, people like Jim Al-Khalil and Brian Cox, they are popularizing science. Even, you can take Neil deGrasse Tyson or many other people out there, right? Now, how is that kind of bias? Somebody who's not doing, how do you feel about that? I mean, you're not considering them as equals, or how is it?
Not considering who as equals.
I mean, people who are not doing. I mean, the other places, right? I mean, in places like UK, that's what he says. They're treated as scientists enough. Science popularizers treated as scientists enough. So, but he says that this is changing in UK.
Okay, I'm not quite aware of that. So is he saying that science popularizers are no longer acknowledged as scientists, or he's saying that uh, scientists are not as foregrounded anymore and not given as much space for popularization of science?
I, I think I understood it the way that, scientists are, probably not, I mean, not getting
You know.
into that space of, yeah, science popularization and not
Oh.
being considered. I mean, Anil could clarify maybe in his comment, I would read, but by the time you could answer this.
Yeah, no, I think I don't think the space required, I don't think the space of, where scientists need to engage with the public has been filled. I mean, there's not enough of it. There's no question that there isn't enough of it in the UK, and even to some extent, even in a very minor extent, even in India. There is engagement, even across disciplines. So, scientists collaborating across disciplines, scientists and artists collaborating with the sort of in the sort of framework of this idea that science is for everyone. So that should be the framework, right? It may be that science research is done by specialists, just like theater is primarily practiced by theater artists, but everybody, I think, needs to be exposed to the mode of inquiry of theater, and similarly, or dance or football or whatever. And everybody needs to engage in all these things at some level. Uh, so similarly, science. I mean, everybody needs to engage with science, needs to have some level of exposure to science, and needs to have scientific thinking as their way of understanding the world around them, regardless of their specialty. So I think in the West, there have been a lot of attempts to bridge the gaps that exist. In the UK, there has been particularly, yes, a lot. Here, there hasn't been as much. Yeah, and it's a problem. But I'm not sure I answered the question.
Yes, I think you did. Yeah, I think he clarified. I think that was the question.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, there's one more question which says that why are Indian scientists very silent? Is it something to be fixed in the primary education field? Getting more kids to speak and speak about science and ask more questions. How can that be done?
I mean, surely that would help. I mean, surely we do need to counter this thing that in schools we have this we don't have a culture of encouraging debate, and there is this thing about obedience to an authority, which is taken to some extreme, and so then children are not encouraged to ask questions. That is certainly a problem. In fact, in another event which happened recently, a scientist from ISER Kolkata was saying that she was trying to teach some biology subject, I don't remember what, and these are undergraduate students. So she said, I'm going to teach on the basis of the questions that you ask. So you have to ask a bunch of questions, and then I will start to teach. And then in her the next class, nobody asked any questions. So she said, okay, sorry, I'm leaving. You don't have any questions. And that pushed them to ask questions. And then they even said things like, they didn't ask questions because they didn't quite trust her. They thought there was some trick, there was some tricky thing involved there. So they didn't see asking questions as something natural. So I think that's a very poor reflection on our education, that children grow up and go through school education without thinking of questioning as a natural thing. So that's certainly a problem. But I still come back to the same thing in science institutions. That is not the barrier. The barrier is that it is not important. It is in the structure tells you that is not important. What is important for your promotion, for your hiring, is you have to publish research papers. That is what is important. So you do that. So unless that changes, you will not have.
True. I think, there's a comment which says, big names in science should lend their weight to oppose such unscientific views of leaders, those who are in public domain and recipients of Padma Awards. Yeah. So that's
Absolutely agree.
yeah, and sure. There's one comment by Anil. He says, this Dr. Francis Collins, leader of Human Genome Project, believes in the literal truth of the Bible. He says he still can't wrap my head about that, similar to ISRO scientists visiting Tirupati before the rocket launch. So, yeah. So,
that is true. I also can't wrap my head around that. I find it hard. But did you say ISRO rocket launch?
yeah.
So that is slightly different, right? Because that's going beyond belief, and it is using the public space and public funds to sort of give expression for some belief which is not necessarily held by the whole institution. So that is problematic in those ways as well. I mean, yeah.
Right. So, I think, there's a nice fact, from Wikipedia, which says that according to some estimate between 1901 and 2000, atheists, agnostics, and freethinkers won about 8.9% of prizes in medicine, 7.1 in chemistry, 5.2 in economics, 4.7 in physics, 3.6 in peace. Alfred Nobel himself was an atheist later in life, so that's something.
Oh, nice. But they're pretty small fractions, huh?
I know, that's true.
Yeah.
Let's accelerate it. I mean, that's something that we'll have to take it forward. So I think pretty much these questions. So I mean, there's one question that I had, words of wisdom from an astrophysicist and a scientist herself. So all the young budding scientists and people, children who are aspiring to be scientists, I mean, what do you want to say, especially when you have to speak about scientific temper and scientific thinking, right? What are some tips that you would like to speak?
Oh wow. Yeah. So first of all, I think that scientific thinking is for everybody. It's not only for scientists. I do think everybody. I do think our education needs to be structured in a way that all students are exposed to all the modes of inquiry. So they need to understand what science is about, what dance is about, what football is about, or some sport, some team sport is about, and so on. So that this sort of, and secondly, in order to excel in anything, regardless of what it is, you need hard work, you need some amount of passion, you need discipline. So it is not that science is something very difficult and somehow only talented people can do it. That is, I think, a myth, and we do need to break that myth. I would say that in any, talent, this idea of talent, I think, is very fraught. It is more about preparedness and exposure and all that. And given the right amount of nurturing and a nurturing environment, anybody can do anything up to some. I mean, there may be some extreme sort of people who have, very, very special ability in some particular thing, like you had this person, Beauty Chand. She was apparently, even as a young child, she would be just like sprinting across her village, like nobody's business. But overall, I would say all of us, who are in the sort of mid-range, with a nurturing environment and a learning environment, anybody can do excel in anything. And so this idea of a hierarchy between different disciplines and so on, I think is counterproductive. So in Indian society in particular, there is this thing, oh, she's really bright, she should do science, or she's really bright, she should do maths. I think that is something we should try to get rid of. Because people can excel and find fulfillment, because that's the main thing, right? As adults, you should pursue something in which you find fulfillment, and be able to pursue that with a reasonable, shall I say, with a reasonable livelihood. So that should be the goal. So having said that, if you really think that you have a passion for science in particular, or whatever, I would say engage with it to the extent possible. Try to talk. So at a younger age, try to talk to scientists and see what their lives are like. Is that the kind of life you want? Try to choose an undergraduate institution which is known for its teaching, not necessarily a very competitive institution. I mean, I personally don't think that competitiveness is a positive thing. So I would say go to an institution where it is more easygoing, but you have good teachers and good laboratories. So in order to pursue science, you do need to get exposed to good science teaching and good laboratories. So that is important. Astrophysics in particular, I would say it is good to hang around with amateur astronomers in your neighborhood. So if there's an astronomy club or something, join it. Amateur astronomers are not necessarily, are by definition not professional astrophysicists, but they are extremely impassioned people. It's really fun to hang around with them. In fact, I sense more passion among them than among professional astrophysicists. They have a variety of careers, teachers, students, whatever, industry, whatever else, but they make the time to follow this passion, and it's very rewarding to hang around with them, and you get a sense of whether this pursuit is for you. I think that's a very good way of doing it. And then in the undergraduate level, I would say pick a few institutions to do now it's quite common for institutions to offer what they call summer internships or summer projects or just internships of longer period. So try to find an institution which does that. Try to look for an institution where not necessarily scientists with big names or institutions with big names, but where you know that the scientists there are helpful and positive to younger people and are good mentors and so on, have good diversity ratios in their faculty and their students, because diversity is always a signature of a more of a nicer climate. And these are things that are not easy to find out. These are not things that are on the website or they're not in their annual reports. These are things that you can only find out by talking to people who are there or who have been through there and all that. So one has to develop a network in order to do that. It's not easy, but yeah. So.
Agreed. True. I think we'll close it with the last question. I mean, it's tied up with Vinay's question. So what does it take to get another Professor Yashpal or even Professor HN? And, just connected to that, even I had this question. We have heroes like Neil deGrasse Tyson, Bill Nye the Science Guy. Why can't we have a science hero in India? What does it take?
Oh, well, I'm sorry, but I have to go back to my same mantra, which is that here we don't have structures which encourage that. So our Hosun Narsimaya or even Jaglur Lakshman Rao, they but I would say that they were not just predisposed, they also had a climate where they flourished and thrived. So, it was not a climate where people asked, okay, if you take such and such, what is the salary you're going to get? And so pick your career based on how much salary you're going to get, right? Those days, the ambience was a bit different. Uh, it was that you could by choice pick a career where you taught and mentored and you found fulfillment in, and that was valued. It was seen as a valued thing to do. I mean, what HN did was valued. Today, if some professor did what he did, live in a single room with only, with very austere sort of amenities and all that, there is this sort of climate in that is stupid. That so that I don't know how to. I don't have the answer as to how to change that. But if you believe in that, I think you should follow in those footsteps. So, but what will bring another HN or another Yashpal, I don't know.
I think, we'll ponder it ourselves. I think, yes, youngsters there are all passionate about science, at least with whom we all interact. I'm sure there'll be many more to come. So, thank you, Prajval. It was pleasure talking to you. I thoroughly enjoyed this discussion. I'm sure the questions that came up, has been very intriguing, especially in the space of scientific thinking. And of course, the role of scientists, what will they, what are people expecting out of them and what themselves they should be doing. So thank you.
There is this thing, one thing I forgot to say, that when, there is the public, because you asked, there was at some point this thing that what can citizens do, right? So I think citizens can view science institutions as publicly owned rather than as some sort of fortresses of some intellectual activity that is beyond their reach. I remember being at some institution where, it was at some event or something where some bunch of children described how they visited such and such institution and how it was so wonderful and how they were so lucky to, be able to go in and look at all this stuff. The point is, that is great that they did all that. And that they enjoyed it and all that. But they should view these things as their right. It is their right to, figure out or find out what's happening within science institutions. It is their right to ask for time from scientists to explain what is happening there, allow them to come in, all that. Whereas, and get exposed to the processes, not just the outcome. Because we have a tendency, like we have this science day, then all the institutions have open day, and it's just that one day the whole year, and so that needs to change as well, and I think that will also help.
Agree. At the end of the day, science and society are interlinked. You cannot bring something to bridge that. All right. So I think we'll thank you again for presenting such great insightful facts and ideas. Many of these questions are the outcome of this. So I thank on behalf of Breakthrough Science Society and of course from the JRL family for being part of this talk. I thoroughly enjoyed this. It's my pleasure to speak to you in this forum. So thank you once again, Prajval.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. So tune on to the next talk next month. So we'll be there. Thank you once again.